Helena, welcome back to Forked. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Why don't we jump in and start talking about some food and politics? What do you say?
I keep trying to take time off and the news just keeps finding me.
That's a tough
So
problem to
yeah,
have.
let's do it.
All right. So, for those of you who listen to Forked, you know that we like to start off with something called the double take. And that's something that happens in the news that's so unusual, oftentimes not so great, that you do a double take. Now, this one's a little bit different for me because this is a thing that happened in the news and it got covered and it talked about. And well, that's it. It kind of went away. I call this the you know where it is, but you don't know where it's at principle. And it's really what it's related to this letter and citizens petition released by David Kessler a couple of weeks ago. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who David Kessler is? I'm sure you're more familiar with him than I am.
Yeah, so David Kessler served as FDA commissioner during both H.W. Bush and the Clinton administration. And he is best known for taking on big tobacco, like really getting FDA to shore up its response to big tobacco. And at the time, everyone said it was crazy, like they were never going to be able to, impose more regulations on tobacco. And he really changed the way this country handles tobacco. So now he's taking on the food industry, and David Kessler actually sent a citizens petition to FDA seeking to essentially ban processed refined carbohydrates. And so that is a term we may need to actually define, because you're like, wait, what does that mean? Um, this would knock out like 80% probably of ultra processed foods, and it's specifically refined carbohydrates used in industrial processing that includes refined sweeteners, refined flour and starches that are subjected to food extrusion technology, which means they're further processed,
Yeah.
and then also sucrose, refined starches, other things. Okay, so the definition is more like, okay, a lot of things that are in processed food, but the important thing he is trying to do here is to say these are no longer generally recognized as safe, which is this thing that keeps coming up called the grass loophole. That's what a lot of people call it. And grass is this way that a lot of substances get on the market or stay on the market without pre-market approval for FDA. And what he's essentially arguing in this very long legal document is that these substances that are very common in ultra processed foods are not generally recognized as safe, and they don't meet the definition because we have lots of definition or lots of evidence of harm. And that is a wildly um threatening take to ultra processed food. I think that's like the simplest way to think about it.
So let's just back up here for a second. There's a lot to unpack there.
A
All
lot.
right. So first, let's go back and let's talk about Kessler himself and what it means to have him speaking to the media in this way and speaking to the country this way, and the Trump administration. So yes, you mentioned he ran the
Former
FDA
FDA commissioner. Yeah.
ran the FDA under Bush and Clinton. So he's a prominent figure, but he has been out of government for a long time. Why does it matter that David Kessler has an opinion about ultra processed foods?
Well, I think being a former FDA commissioner gives you a lot of heft in this situation. Of any former FDA commissioner asking FDA to do anything is something that carries a level of seriousness that is different from a random citizen. Like anyone can petition FDA. It's called a citizens petition. But to have a former FDA commissioner do that carries a lot of weight. It's also interesting because Kessler has been thinking about these issues of food and like what to do about the public health implications of food for a long time. He's written 3 books. I think that I'm going to blank on what the most recent one is called: Drugs, Dopamine. Sorry, that you can look at it, but it just came out. And he has really struggled with this, like as a regulator, as a public health um, leader, like what should FDA do about food? He's been thinking about this for a very, very long time. He told me, I talked to him about this petition, and he basically said, like, it took me, writing 3 books to really finally figure out what I think should be done, essentially. So there's a lot of legal rigor here. There is a lot of thoughtfulness and also I think, seriousness because of who it's coming from. That said, it is so threatening to the landscape of food that it's hard to see FDA jumping at this, but essentially Kessler is handing the Trump administration, here is a way you could go after ultra processed foods, which RFK constantly says are poisoning us. Kessler's essentially saying, here is a legal way to attack these foods.
Well,
And
I want to talk about
we'll
that, Helena.
see. Yeah.
But let's talk about that way, and because that's the interpretation, right?
Mhm.
That if you were to read the media reaction to this, it's that he was backing RFK and his, and this is from the Times. He's
Mhm.
backing RFK in his war on ultra processed foods, and I mean, I believe that it's New York Times. They must be right, huh? But I think I had a little bit of a different reaction. I read the letter that he wrote that accompanies the petition. I want to just
Mhm.
read a little bit of it, and it
Yeah.
says, you have made ultra processed foods a central focus of your health agenda and argued that the increased intake of ultra processed foods is a primary culprit, and that's in scare quotes, behind an epidemic of chronic disease in the United States, right? So
Mhm.
I could read more, but I just want to pause there. Like, I read that as sneering, right? He was pushing the buttons of RFK, and in a way, and you gotta I'll stop talking a second. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but to me, he's kind of throwing down the gauntlet to RFK Jr., to FDA, to MAHA, to Fox News, to Laura Loomer, whatever. Do something about this problem. I don't think he's backing anything, frankly.
Well, I don't think he's sneering. I think he's really serious. And I think this petition, in a lot of ways, takes RFK at his word, right? Like, you have
Really,
said
you think
these
he's taking it
things.
as word?
Yes.
I think he's.
I
This
think
is
he's saying,
the subtly undermining thing
I
happening
think
here.
he's saying, you have said these things. And if you are
Yes,
serious about them, here is a way to
to do
use the
something about it.
regulatory system to
But I'll
attack
say
them.
this: when
Yeah.
I'm mad at my kids, and they have not come home when they said they have, or when
Do they do
they're
that?
going to, well, they're older now. My son is 19. My daughter is 14 and
Mm.
12. When they haven't done the things that they're supposed to
Yeah.
do, like take out the garbage, I say, you have told me that you will take out the garbage, and yet you have not. But here is a path forward in the future for you to take out the garbage, and it involves you taking out the garbage, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is how that reads to
He's
me.
definitely
You know?
calling a bluff, like, of here, or here is, it's put up or shut up, right? It's
Yes.
here is a way to seriously bring down the hammer on ultra processed foods, which I think they agree that, I think the two of them would agree that both Kessler and Kennedy would agree that they are causing some level of metabolic harm. They are contributing to growing rates of chronic disease, particularly among children. Like, they are seeming to agree on that.
Yeah.
Now,
Maybe.
giving them away to giving FDA, saying, here is a way to really go after these, it puts the ball in FDA's court to be like, okay.
Well, let's talk about that. Okay,
Yeah.
so the petition itself is 66 pages long. I did
Mhm.
not read all 66 pages. I got the
It's
highlights.
dense. Yep.
You know what I did? I read the Food Fix newsletter and I
There
learned
you
all
go.
about it.
There you go.
So the things, but it does seem to me, and you read that quote earlier, that what he is calling on the administration to do is not possible, right? And that it just isn't, right? These
Why do you
things
think it's not
cannot happen
possible?
because they're too big, right? The things that they're talking about. If and
Mhm.
again, it's a little
I'm
complex,
not
and
arguing
maybe I'm
it'll happen,
misunderstanding.
right. No, no, no,
Yeah,
I think it's a
but he's saying
the
basically everything, every kind of ultra processed food, everything that uses corn in an industrial way, everything that uses syrup, all these things are going to just be, cleared the decks. And I don't see how that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It would, like, it's not feasible in just, like, switching, like, flipping a switch. What I think Kessler would argue is that it's not necessarily that all these foods have to go away, it's that then they
Yeah,
would have to go through what's called a food additive petition, and they would actually have to
right,
seek FDA approval. They would have to say, "Hey,
yeah,
look, here's the evidence that,
right. The proof's in the
this
grass. The proof's in the
combination
grass. Yeah, I get it.
here's the evidence we have that this combination of of, that this ultra processed or this processed refined carbohydrate is safe. And that is putting the onus back on the food industry to say, we have the evidence that X is safe. And that's a different thing. So maybe many of these things could be used, but they have not um, met in his argument the bar. So it's a super interesting legal argument. The Obama administration actually did ban trans fat using this same mechanism. They
Yeah.
said basically partially hydrogenated oils are no longer considered generally recognized as safe because there was so much evidence of cardiovascular harm. So
And
you
that was an
can't
historic thing. That
It
was an
was a
historic thing, but that's
historic, it was a
also
huge deal.
much, much, much
Super
narrower
mu
than what he's
and
calling for.
also the food industry had in many ways moved away from
Right.
trans fat because of all of the evidence, against them. And so, yes, this would be much, much bigger. It's one of those things where it's almost impossible to see it happening, but it raises a lot of really important legal questions. Even this document existing pokes some holes in the idea of generally recognized as safe. Generally recognized kind of carries with it that there is a consensus. And
Right.
having a major figure like this essentially lay out a document saying there isn't a consensus is in and of itself questioning like whether or not there
So I think in that respect,
something is
we
generally
are
recognized. Yeah.
we are kind of in our own weird way in alignment a little bit that this is not necessarily a document that presents a path forward, as he says in the document that it is a path forward, but that it is a
It's a
challenge
radical
to the
path.
administration. Right.
Yeah, I
So
think it
I
is
want
a challenge
yeah, yeah,
it is certainly asking the administration to go big and to do big things. And it's an interesting moment because I think they do have a lot more political capital to do big things,
yeah,
but the food industry, is pushing back really hard. This is such a radical idea that it's almost like they can't comprehend it when they read this. That is how big it is. I'm not saying it's not radical, but
right.
we'll see.
We'll
I
see.
didn't
Yeah.
expect this to happen. A lot this
Well,
came out of left field for a lot of people.
one of the things about citizens petitions, they are a formal process,
Mhm.
and the government has 180 days to respond to it, and we will see what we will see. So, with that, I want to move on
Yeah,
to our
if there's
next
no way
segment.
FDA is gonna, like,
Right,
substantively respond to it that quickly,
right.
but we'll see. Yeah.
They have 180 days. Well, you never know. The next section of our episode is the forks and knives episode, part of the episode, and that's just sort of the status quo, the things that are the main thing that's happening in the food and politics world. And I think it's actually somewhat illustrative when you look at what Kessler is talking about to then talk about what I think you should do for force and knives, which is the leaked MAHA strategy
Mhm.
document, which lays out the plan for what RFK Jr. and the government are actually going to do about all these things. And it is not a radical reorganization of the food system in the
Mm-mm.
way that David Kessler is envisioning it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this document?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we should say, this is not the formal, we have not had the formal rollout. This is a leaked version, and so it could
Okay.
change. And the White House is essentially saying, it may change. So, with all of those caveats, the leaked strategy, does not bring down a big regulatory hammer, across really any of these industries. I think my biggest takeaway from reading through it is just how much particularly the agriculture industry gets off. So there was a lot we've talked about, a lot of the pressure from MAHA to regulate certain things. And one of those things that they really have a lot of concerns about are pesticides, particularly glyphosate and atrazine. And this document not only does not propose more regulation, it essentially proposes, like, ways to make the public, like, more confident in the current regulatory system we have,
It
which
barely
is
mentions
so
pesticides
barely
at all.
mentions it,
Yeah.
barely.
Yeah.
So you when I look at this, I'm like, "Oh, agriculture, like, really effectively lobbied here." Like, they completely changed, I think, the direction that a lot of the MAHA, um advocates hoped this would go, right? It is I think a little bit more complicated for the food side. So even though it doesn't have anything like what Kessler proposed, like really coming at hard, the processed food industry really hard, there are certain things in here that the food industry really does hate. So like they have front of pack labeling in here, like advancing some version of that. They still have, the dietary guidelines, which are supposed to, or they're expected to tell us to all reduce consumption of ultra processed foods. They back grass reform, which is essentially closing the loophole we talked about earlier, where basically FDA would have a much more active role in how food chemicals get to market. And so there are certainly things in here the food industry really hates. But overall, when you zoom out, it's just in no way does this document match, I think, the rhetoric of MAHA. The
Not
rhetoric
at
of
all. Not
MAHA
at
is we're
all.
being poisoned and the government or society and everything needs to change. That is not in any way with this. I mean, it doesn't talk about farm subsidies. There's nothing systemic. There's nothing in here that I think would match, like, especially the maha on the campaign trail we saw.
Not at all. I mean, it is the opposite of that. It is a lot of talk and not a lot of policy and not a lot of action at all. I mean, I think
A lot
the
of
question for
research, a lot of task forces, a lot of evaluations of, like, things that are important, like evaluating microplastics, like, yes, but if your administration maybe only has 3 years, like, I think the argument is, like, you don't really have time to do all this evaluation,
no,
and if you look at what Kennedy and his allies were saying coming in, they were talking about action. They wanted to take action, they wanted to reverse chronic disease within 2 years, like, to do some of the things they were talking about, you cannot have a task force.
a task
Yeah.
force plus $3.50 will get you half a cup of coffee in Manhattan these days. That's about it. That's all it's good for. Yes, we have to have task force, but we also have to be cognizant of what that actually means, which is nothing, right? To me, I think you're right that of your in your assessment of it, but I think what I would really try to understand is why, right? In previous episodes of the
Mhm.
show, we've talked about how come Democrats didn't do this here thing in the
Mhm.
past? How come
Yeah.
they couldn't get this done? So is the question, well, it's actually kind of hard to govern, right? Or they're full of it, or something else. Like what is the reason for this milk toast strategy report, which yes is not final.
Well, I mean, it could kind of be all of the above. I think it comes down to what we've talked about so much, which is like the contradiction that is central to the concerns about the food system and then your unwillingness to, like, for regulation to be a a dirty word. Like, that tension is just maybe impossible to work out, right? And if you're talking about the food system poisoning us, and then you're saying, "Okay, well, what we need to do is, like, study it more or have, like, a task force to look at something." I mean, that just doesn't match up. And so but the word deregulation appears more in this document because that is the ideology of this administration and overall, right? And so it's just I just how do you square those 2 things? I think that's where it comes down to, like, I think there are probably people within the administration who would wanna do bigger things, but, like, do they have permission to actually seek those things in this ideological framework, you know? Like
Well, why? I mean, I agree. I look. I'm more skeptical of government, I guess, in general than maybe you are. I don't want to speak for you, but this does not surprise me. This
Mhm.
is sort of the nature of what we have seen so far with RFK Jr. in his role at HHS. He's done a lot of meaningful things, right? That haven't been done in the past, but in a lot of ways, he has oftentimes relied on putting the bull in bully pulpit. That's about it, right? Uh, Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think some of the most important things they're doing in terms of impact, like where
Yeah.
you see changes happening are using the bully pulpit, right? Like to have the FDA commissioner come on and say ultra processed foods are not good for you, to have HHS secretaries say we're being poisoned. Those are that's using the bully pulpit, right? But that's not using the actual, like, policy mechanisms they have at their disposal.
This is why I get back to
Yeah.
Kessler, though. When I think back on Kessler and the language that he used, he is reacting against the bully pulpit idea of government. He is looking at these things and saying, all right, you said it. Now do it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
And
I'm
well,
sorry, I didn't mean to
they're
interrupt
getting
you.
a lot there has been so much criticism to this leaked strategy. I think we should talk about that for a second. Like,
Yeah.
it's MAHA advocates are disappointed. They are furious that they have backed away from any, like, action at all on pesticides. Like, furious, right? They're basically saying, like, "We elected you to do something about many issues, and pesticides was one of them."
And yet again, I
Um
find myself in agreement with them. They're right. We should do something about pesticides. I don't know necessarily that I have the answer for what it should be, and neither do I know that I want the MAHA folks to be in charge of making that do something happen. But yeah, something ought to happen.
It's like it's one of those things too where EPA, there's also like, well, EPA is not under RFK, right? Like I've always said EPA is like the least MAHA of all the agencies. And so, if you look at what they're doing at EPA, they're trying to speed approvals for pesticides. They're
What do
trying
you
to
mean?
get rid of
What do you mean? MAHA is the EPA
least
is the
MAHA.
least
The
MAHA?
least
Yeah,
MAHA
but
in that they're like Lee Zeldin coming in, he was not seen as like someone who was going to carry forward the MAHA agenda, right? Like,
I
there's
see.
always been some tension there. But I
Okay.
think to see this strategy, this leaked strategy, not, at least pay lip service to the things that MAHA wants on pesticides, which is generally speaking a crackdown, it was really stark. And almost every statement I've seen come out, I think actually every statement I've seen come out reacting to the leaked MAHA strategy has been extremely negative. Like, calling it offensive to basically a slap in the face to MAHA voters. I mean, the language being used here is really, really critical. And we'll see. I mean, they could potentially change some of this before they formally release it. That would be super interesting if they did, but
But
um
it's unlikely, right? I mean, this is a pretty harsh
yeah.
comparison, but the Roe v. Wade decision leaked before it came out, and when it finally came out, it was largely the same. They didn't
Yeah.
leak it. When a leak like this is not
We
some
still
sort
don't know
of
how it got leaked. Yeah.
Pentagon,
I was
right? But I
fun
mean, they
story. I
probably
was
leaked it on
actually
purpose, right?
I was actually in the newsletter when or in the Politico newsroom when that story was being worked on.
Yeah.
And one of my memories is walking past Josh Gerstein, who was one of the reporters on that story, and I was like, "Hey, Josh, what are you working on?" He was just like he just, like, ran, like, away from me. Anyway, side note. I at
Well,
the
all
time
right.
was like,
Yeah, go
"Oh,
ahead.
wow, that was a really big scoop." Yeah,
That was a big scoop.
yeah.
The other thing when you talk about the reception of this strategy document, it gets at a certain source of tension within the Trump
Mhm.
administration that I think also came into view recently, which I think is, again, maybe it's a little cynical, worthy of a good vibes discussion, right? And that is the MAHA versus MAGA blow up recently with Laura Loomer calling RFK Jr. disloyal, suggesting that he wants to run for president, which he denied, and maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But I want you to talk about the bigger picture here, which is what is the nature of the disagreement between what people are using? They're using these terms, MAHA versus MAGA. What does that mean? Who's disagreeing with who about what?
Well, I think in general, the Maha-MAGA marriage is it's just a little fraught, right? And it gets at so much of what we've been talking about with this contradiction, I think. Maha got woven into the MAGA base or the Trump base, specifically in the lead up to the November election, with the sole goal of building that coalition so that Trump could win. And there are a lot of people who think RFK did help Trump win. But
I think
within
there's no doubt about
yeah,
that. I
with
mean that,
well, yeah, I mean, I'm not an, like, elections nerd, so,
yeah.
I haven't myself looked at the data, but a lot of people believe that, and Laura Loomer, I think, actually said I think it was maybe during that she did a podcast with Politico, she said something like, "I don't think I'm gonna get, like, RFK fired," right? Like, there is a certain alliance there that is, I think, fairly strong, maybe because of that very key role that RFK played in RFK Jr.
By the
played in the
way,
election.
do we need to identify Laura Loomer? Should we
I
just call her
mean,
a gadfly? What do we what's the right
she's
terminology here?
far right media person or a I don't yeah, provocateur. I mean,
Luminary?
some people call her
MAGA luminary?
some people call her a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah,
I mean, there's so much there, and
right.
I would say that Laura Loomer, we know that she's gotten several people fired. She affects the actual White House policy in many ways, and so she's this very bizarre outside voice that a lot of people do pay attention to because she does have real influence within uh, the White House. So here we are. I mean, she was a guest on Politico's podcast, so she is a person with influence.
So
She made
let's
some
talk about the
comment, like, "I'm not
specifics.
gonna get
Yeah,
RFK
yeah.
fired," but she's going
No.
after, his deputy chief of staff, Stephanie
All right,
Spear.
so
Yeah.
let's talk about that because I think it's really interesting, right? So this all sort of stems from an attack that she made online to, yes, Stephanie Spear, a name that most people may not be too familiar with. She is the top aide to RFK Jr., and she was his press secretary in
Yeah.
his run for the presidency. Now, what I find interesting about it, I'd like you to talk about it a little bit. We talk about this divide between MAHA and MAGA, which sort of very broadly would split along lines of like food safety, nutrition, and health on the MAHA side, and the MAGA side maybe being the anti-vax. But Stephanie Spear, she is pretty squarely in the anti-vax world, right? She got her start with RFK Jr. by working for the Children Health Defense, which is a pretty anti-vax organization, right?
So, yeah, I think MAHA definitely I think the MAHA umbrella very much includes the health freedom, the anti-vaccine, it also includes raw milk and fluoride and, like, there's a lot of stuff in there, right? The food and nutrition stuff,
Yeah.
that we focus more on food policy on this podcast, and also the food and nutrition stuff is the most popular among all the MAHA issues, and so there's this it's a big tent, though. I think Stephanie Spear she is very much a MAHA person, and there is some tension between MAGA and MAHA in that some of the MAHA people are not traditional Trump. They're not longtime loyal Trump people. They're not
No,
longtime
Spear was a
loyal MAGA
Democrat.
people.
She was a
Yes.
Democrat. Yeah,
Well, RFK Jr. ran as a
was a
Democrat
Democrat.
before he ran as an independent. Like, he is a
Oh yeah,
Kennedy, right? We
who
forget.
knew?
He is a Kennedy. So, there's a lot of mistrust over that, over the, like, "You were not originally on this team." Like, you are not a Trump original, you are that so the MAHA people kind of come into the MAGA tent, and it's not always, I think, a seamless or comfortable, like, alliance. I think that's the way I think about it anyway. Um,
Well,
it's
let
not
me ask you
even
a
so
question to
much
that.
over
L-
policy. I think
Yeah.
it's sometimes over, like, the loyalty. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that for a second because one of the things that's a phenomenon of the Trump age, I believe, is this sort of comforting notion that we on the center or on the left or wherever the heck you may be that is not a Trump supporter, we always think that they're going to get him, right? This is the thing that's going to bring the whole thing down, right? And
Yeah.
this is yet another one of these things: MAHA versus MAGA. What will the meaning be for Trump? Will it really impact him? And I'm curious if you think that this is an actual divide that will have meaningful consequences for the Trump administration and what policy we see, or is this just yet another of these Democratic fantasies that Trump
Mhm.
is going somewhere?
Well, I don't think it affects the Trump administration really at all, although certainly they pay attention to reaction on, like, X and whatever. So when I am sure that administration officials are looking at this extremely negative reaction to the MAHA strategy, and they're noticing that. I don't know if they'll change the approach, but, like, that is a noticeable thing. Um, but what I think is more interesting is, like, what about the midterms? Like, you now have MAHA leaders saying, "If Republicans don't really get in line on this MAHA stuff, our votes are up for grabs in the midterms." And so, do you see a MAHA, like, voting block that's more fluid on party line. I mean,
That it
I
swings back
don't
to the
know.
Democrats? Maybe. I doubt that, but
It's
yeah,
like,
maybe.
they're saying, like, if Republicans don't get in line, I mean, you've even had Alex Clark, who's very, close with Turning Points, that Charlie Kirk, like, big, like, MAGA youth organizing kind of, apparatus. She had an all caps tweet or post on X the other day that was just like, "This is not what we asked for," like, I mean, really threatening, like, kinda like voters are up for grabs if Republicans
I will
don't
say
move,
I
so
haven't I
I
haven't
don't
used
know.
X. I haven't used X in years, but even
You're
back before it
saving
was Twitter.
yourself from a lot of really
But I do
the
miss,
the algorithm's horrifying, but the all caps stuff, you can really get your point across,
that's
like,
what I was gonna
really
say.
get there with an all
I
caps, yeah.
do miss a good old all caps tweet, it's just like a cold glass of water in the morning, all right, so
Uh,
I think we've covered a lot today. I want to stop there just because I want to take in all this stuff. I'm still thinking about David Kessler and what he was trying to do.
yeah,
But it's
if
that you have said this. You got to go talk to my kids. They will tell you what that means.
if anyone listening to this wants to print it out and read, either you can even just read the letter, but read the 66 pages. I think you'll come away with like a, "Oh, okay." I mean, this is like lobbing a bomb in a way.
It's a pretty angry second person. So,
So
Helena, before we
hot
go,
doc, yeah.
I want to do what I always do on each episode. I want to stop by telling everybody that they should sign up for your fantastic newsletter, but only if you can tell them how to do it.
Yeah, so you can go to foodfix.co, get your email on the list. We have a newsletter every Friday, except for, I was trying to be on break, kind of. There's just too much news. But yeah, get on the list.
Folks, you should pay for it too. Don't just do the free thing. Free thing is no good. You got to pay. All right. Yeah, so I'm sorry, Helena, you were going to say something?
No, I was just gonna say you gotta get on the list, and then you'll see how good it is, and then you'll eventually pay. That's how I get you.
Yes. Helena is a true believer in the marketing funnel. I'm with her.
Mhm.
So thank you again, Helena. It's always fun talking to you and hearing what is happening out there in the world of food and politics. And I will see you again in 2 weeks.
All right, talk to you soon.
Thanks very much.